Hey guys, Yonas here. Don't forget to click down below to like and subscribe for more card game content. Thank you guys for your continued support, and I hope you guys enjoyed today's video.
All right, welcome back, guys. This is Clyde, and
Jonas, how you
uh,
guys doing?
yep, back with our first video on the channel. So excited to have us. Name still TBD, so watch out for that. But here we have an OP 8.5 tier list, and you've been playing a lot too, right? We've both been playing a lot 8.5.
Yeah, basically every single day whenever I have some spare time. I'm even in between regional tournaments, I'm just like playing 8.5 games to get a feel for it. So I've been jamming a lot and getting a good feel of the format.
Yeah, OP8 was kind of a downer in that it didn't really change that much. It was still a lot of the same from OP7, so 8.5 is definitely a breath of fresh air.
100%.
So we definitely separated into four tier lists, or four tiers in our tier list. We have S tiers, which are like the decks that will probably top the most. A tier are the decks that you'll see occasionally top. B tier, maybe like once in a blue moon, you'll see it top, and then F tier are the decks that probably aren't meta relevant, but somebody might be crazy enough to find something spicy. But yeah, we'll put the decks that we don't think are relevant going to be in S tier or F tier.
Yeah,
Anything you want to add?
basically, that's basically the crux of it. A lot of the time, when you have like C and D tiers, there's not really much information there. They're kind of just other decks that might just be like decks you really want to play, pet decks, stuff like that. So we really want to really focus on the list that we are considering to bring to a tournament, or like things we will see a lot of as our opponents are playing them throughout the regionals.
Yeah, for sure. And then one thing to note is that we kind of have a unique format in that we have 8.5 with the RP law bans. I know that Asia and Japan also had it, but they had it for like only a couple of weeks and they didn't really have any major tournaments with 8.5 with the law bans. So we get kind of a fresh take on the meta without having too much Asian data or Asian and Japan data to go off of. All right, and let's get started.
Awesome. You
Let's
want to start with the most important thing, S tier?
yeah.
Um, I only have three decks in my personal S tier. They're Dofi, BY, and Lucci. If you agree on those three, I want to have a discussion about what you think of the best are in what order. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
but do you think those are the three best decks, or are there any other decks you want to consider, or you don't think make the list?
I think yeah, these are my top three decks as well. Some people might make a case for some of the A tier decks that we're gonna list later, but I think by far like these are like undisputed top three at least. I don't think anybody would really argue with you if you put these in top three. And yeah, I think it'd be fun to see which ones you put around which order. So I put them in like a random order for now, but which do you think is like the top S tier?
For me, I think it's Dofi is number one, Black Yellow Luffy is number two, and Lucci is number three. But number two and three, I think, are extremely close.
Yeah,
Um, So I think the Dofi deck, just like the inclusion of both the forecast Boa and the Law, it gives this deck like way too much of a tempo advantage against a lot of the decks, and even like the older like Lucci lists are gonna fall like really far behind when like this deck just draws like two Jinbeis basically when it like puts it in play on their 3 down turn and on their 5 down turn. Um, and even against BY because of the extra tools, alongside the old stuff like Perfume Femur, Pudding, and Kaido if you still want to play that alongside Gravity Blade, Raging Tiger, the deck just has access to too many cards to beat all of the scary matchups.
yeah.
Um,
I think the biggest thing, like you mentioned, is like the consistency. Like out of these three, I think Lucci is definitely the least consistent. It makes it an easy third for me. BY is a really consistent deck, but if you've never played Dope before, like try it out. Like your deck is so consistent. You run 12 one costs to start off your engine or start off your curve, and I honestly probably never had a game where I bricked with Dofi. Like I had less optimal games where I don't see four Jinbei or I don't see exactly my curve, but even then, like your low roll is still better than a lot of people's mid rolls or high rolls.
it's kind of absurd. Um, and it might seem like when you're testing against online, like, oh, my opponent got so lucky finding like two Jinbeis on curve. When your opponent just like starts the game off with two Sengokus and a Perona, they're gonna see like almost more than half their or like half their deck on like the 3 down turn. They're gonna find a lot of these pieces, and having access to that level of consistency is just like super powerful in this game.
Yeah. After that, we have BY second, and we're both like decent BY players. I think you've won like done pretty well with it. I've done like decently well with it, but I think it's
Casual
still.
2 wins
Yeah,
bonus.
I think it's still in a great place just because the Dofi matchup to me it was kind of 50-50 before, but now that they're cutting out cards like Red Rock or Kaido or 10 cost Kaido and even Gravity Blade, the Dofi matchup is kind of BY favored now.
Yep. A lot of the early aggression from Dofi is powerful sometimes against BY, but it's not really going to close the game out, which is the main issue. And the fact that the deck's like so much more like lean. makes it so that becoming a 7K or 9K leader, especially when BY is able to set it up with an extra life, is going to be almost impossible to power through, especially in the late game. Not to mention, Mori is still a very good card in this game.
Right. And then that leads us to our third deck of the S tier, which is Lucci. There's not much to say about this except that you're kind of handicapping yourself because you have to tech for the Dofi matchup, and then the techs for Dofi matchup hurts your other matchups like the Mirror and Black Yellow Luffy. But that doesn't change the fact that you probably are like one of the best decks into Dofi, outside of like yellow decks like maybe Vegapunk or now Lucci is probably like the top deck that is good into what is perceived like the best deck in the format.
I would 100% agree. It's very similar to O7 in that regard, where like RP Law was a very powerful deck. And Lucci could build itself to be very good against RP Law between like the Ennis Lobby stuff, Akos Sabo, all that extra stuff. But at the same time, you made your deck a lot worse against BY. It's the kind of the same dynamic happening in this format with just a different leader, basically. Um, and when in this kind of moment in the format where we just don't really know what the format's going to look like, it's really hard to build a Lucci deck that kind of caters to beating everything. So, at least for right now, I'm not particularly high on Lucci, but I think it has a lot of potential once the format gets a little bit more solved throughout the next couple weeks.
Yeah, for sure. So that was our S tier. I think that was a pretty easy one, and I think like a lot of people have the same opinion. So we can go on to A tier, and then I'll add some of the decks I think, and then you let me know what you think as well. I'm definitely gonna put Bonnie here, Purple Luffy. I actually put Enel in here as well, and I'm looking. If you see something as well, you can just add it too. I'm just looking around.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. There's not really that much. I think those like the reasonable contenders that all have a potentially good matchup into one of the top decks. Um, you could also consider a deck like Nami or Black Luffy just because they exist from the other formats, but I think they're closer to B.
Mm.
Um, but I think those like the main three decks in the A tier. Um, which of the three, which one of you like the most? Because I have my opinions, but I'm curious what your deck of the three you've preferred.
Of the three, I actually like you. Are you saying in terms of playing or in terms of like how good I think it is?
Both. In terms of what you like to enjoy and also how good it is.
In terms of playing, I think Purple Luffy is like an extremely fun deck. Like you're just curving out, you're like playing big bodies, and your big bodies like you're not just playing a bunch of vanillas anymore, like the old list. Not just playing like 4-6 vanillas or like 7-9 vanillas. You're actually playing bodies that have good stat lines and have good effects. So that's been one of the decks I've loved playing the most. The biggest problem with Purple Luffy is that your Dofi matchup is like terrible. I think we played it, and I think I won like one game out of 10. And even games where I low roll as Dofi into Purple Luffy, I think I still beat him. Like I've missed the first two leader effects, and I still beat Purple Luffy. I just think that matchup is terrible.
Yeah, the main problem is I think the main way for that deck to catch up in the Dofi versus Poofy matchup is the new 5-cost Sangoro from the starter deck alongside Luffy Taro, just because you need that extra card advantage. And the deck isn't consistent as it really needs to be at the V right now because of the cards in OP9 that kind of make it a lot more powerful and a lot more consistent. So that is right now, if you just don't draw that engine and a lot of also good follow up afterwards, you're just gonna fall way too far behind. Not to mention just like one or two Jinbeis will just make the game like almost impossible to power through from the Floofy side.
Right. But yeah, that was the most fun deck I've played or of this format. But I think of these decks, the ones closest to S tier is actually Bonnie. It might seem
I
weird.
would 100% agree. Yeah.
Right. Because everybody's looking like, oh, Dofi is a bad matchup for Bonnie, so why would it be close now, especially when Dofi's the best deck? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that the deck kind of had a little bit of an overhaul in 8.5, mostly because I think it needs to try to be as best as it can towards Dofi. But I do think Cracker from OP8 alongside 8-cost Kid being a lot more prevalent in Bonnie is like an actual very viable game plan against Dofi. Especially lists that aren't playing cards like Gum Gum Red Rock. Or like Gravity Blade to kind of clear all these early 5-cost bodies. It's really hard for Dofi to like stick too many things and have a lot of other things matter. Um, there are cards for Dofi to play to make the matchup good, but I do think that between Carrot and Kid, I think it's like relatively good from the Bonnie side if the Dofi player is caught lacking with their list.
Yeah, and it's kind of the similar reasoning as the BY Luffy, where they cut out Red Rock, Kaido's, Gravity Blade, and those are the cards that really hurt the Bonnie matchup. So now it's a little bit closer, especially like with the 4 carrots, like you mentioned. Kid might not even get answered because of Red Rock. The only annoying card you have to play around is Pudding. But I think this matchup is closer. It might still be BY favored depending on the Dofi favored depending on the Dofi list. But I think Bonnie is in a pretty good position to kind of sneak more tops than the other decks in A tier. And that brings us to our last deck, which is Anel. And I know you probably have a lot of feelings on Anel. How are you feeling about it in 8.5?
So the pros of this deck, I think it's actually quite good into Dofi, unless the Dofi list is explicitly playing 10 cost Kaido. I think it makes it close when they have 10 cost Kaido, the draw 4 Kaido. But aside from that, a lot of the yellow cards are just naturally very good at dealing with 4 cost bodies. And Dofi is a very easy deck to kind of starve of resources and leaving them at 5 life. So because of that, just like the power of just like Yamatoing, Gadatsuing, 5 cost Nami, and just like Ace is just going to overwhelm a lot of Dofi's draws, alongside just yellow triggers being obnoxious. So because of that, I'm like pretty high on Anel at least week 1 because of that reason. The main problem is I think that like almost all of the other matchups can still be quite rough.
Right.
Bonnie can still be kind of difficult just because like the new 9 cost Shanks is really good at like clearing up board. BY Luffy is kind of close always, but like the more that BY Luffy can play more Kuzans and more Ice Ages to deal with bodies, the matchup can be like atrocious sometimes. And then Lucci still like a very, very difficult matchup to play. So because of that, like I think Anel's very geared towards beating the best deck, or at least our opinion, the best deck in Dofi, but it kind of has to struggle a lot into these other matchups. So I'm kind of lukewarm on it, but if you expect a lot of Dofi, it's a pretty good choice.
Right. So it could be teetering the edge of A and B, but we can give it A for now, at least in the beginning format. And then later, as it settles and more people play like non-Dofi decks, it might bump down a little bit. Yeah, and then like for our B tier, let's mention the 2 decks that you mentioned first. Let's do the one that everybody's probably excited to see out of either A or S tier is Nami. And Nami probably like nothing changes in the deck, but it's just that the 2 most popular decks or the 2 decks that got the most buffs are Dofi and Purple Luffy, and those matchups are dreadful for Nami.
Yeah, I do think that Nami really thrives in a relatively grindy, slow format, and 8.5 was not the, or 8 wasn't the most fun, but it was also a relatively grindy format between BY and Lucci being the 2 best decks. So because of that, Nami was like super powerful, did very well in Paris, did very well in Milan recently as well. And Dofi is just like way too difficult of a matchup for like multiple different axes. One is the fact that they having too many 5k bodies and like relatively large bodies before Nami can set up can just be a nightmare in terms of just general aggression. But even more so, pudding can also be a nightmare from the Bonnie or from the Nami side. If Dofi kind of just spends a lot of time just building board and the Nami player doesn't have access to like Apis or other ways to kind of get cards out of its hand, they'll eventually just amass a hand of too many cards, and all of a sudden all that work you've been doing drawing cards every turn's kind of been wasted with Nami.
Yeah, so Nami, like, maybe you get to wait till OP9 comes out when you get the new 1 cost Nami, the one that searches an event. But yeah, we don't expect it to do much in 8.5, maybe getting a couple of tops here and there depending on how your matchups go.
Yep.
All right, and then the other deck we want to talk about is the ST14 Luffy. And usually, like, you would think that Dofi would struggle into black decks, but besides Lucci, there's not a lot of black decks that can really KO 2 bodies at one time. So if your Dofi opponent plays a Jinbei on you, how do you KO both?
You honestly just you kind of fall relatively far behind unless you like had a 3 cost broken like miraculously have like a double clear on your 5 dawn turn. A lot of times you're just going to fall a little bit too far behind when your opponent like plays 2 characters and then plays 2 more characters and starts barraging you with swings.
Right. So yeah, I do think like SC Luffy is probably close, but I think it just might struggle into Dofi with how wide they go very quickly.
Yep. It does have a lot of tools to kind of beat the decks that existed before. Like having a bunch of awkward numbers of clears in terms of just like having 9 cost Morias, 5 cost Rebecca's can still be very obnoxious into decks. But ultimately, I think it's just going to be a little bit too clunky. But maybe you can try to maneuver the deck to be a little bit better in other matchups.
Yep, sounds good.
Yep. Any other fun decks that or like decks you think in B tier that are like potentially going to be topping these next couple weeks?
Oh yeah.
I've seen. Or go ahead.
Oh yeah, I'm glad. Yeah, Marco is probably like the deck that I've been playing the most in 8, just because BY didn't change much, so I didn't really need much practice in 7. But Marco, surprisingly, is really strong with the new 7 cost Newgate. You have basically a perfect card to match up with your leader. Like your leader's in every turn power reduction, and now you have an every turn KO. I think it's really strong into decks like Bonnie, like even Purple Luffy, because they can just rest their bodies. You can use swing over them by minusing 4k, and then you just go wide really fastly with 9 cost Sanji. The struggles with this is like Dofi, you can't really do much against a 7k swing every turn. You have like one blocker, which is a 4-cost Marco blocker, so you can get overrun really quickly.
Yeah, and sometimes you can't get rid of everything on curve, even though Newgate is a very powerful card in terms of clearing a lot of like the mid-rangey sized bodies. When someone like swarms 25Ks, it can still be a nightmare.
Yeah. All right. How about you? Did you have any decks in B
All right.
tier that you pick?
I really want to talk about Vegapunk. This deck did a lot of, or it, a lot, couple players played it in Japan for a while. I think it got a top 16 in a GAO a couple months ago, and I do think the deck is quite powerful. The deck is just really difficult to pilot. I'm struggling with the deck myself, but I think there's a lot of like opportunities for the deck to be super successful. The main problem with the deck is I think that a lot of the tools it has are very similar to an O. It has a few better ways to kind of like trigger and survive between like the blockers and like Rayquaza help as the one cost event. But ultimately, I think it's probably just going to be a worse NL that's better at playing around pudding. So because of that, I think it has a more lopsidedly good Dofi matchup, but I think it has a kind of worse matchup spread in general aside from that. The deck
Right.
is really fun though. I'm not sure if you've tried it. It's a grindy one though, so I'm not entirely sure if you want to sit through like a 30-minute round every round either.
Right. Yeah, I did try it a little bit, and I think the matchup that got me off the deck is playing against Lucci. When Lucci gets to the bottom of the deck and they can just keep luching or looping Tempest Kick, Moria like every turn, I just felt like unwinnable at that point. And it seems like a really common win condition for Lucci against these grinding decks like Vegapunk. Like I've had them do that against me when I was playing it now, or even Pudding, where I could just keep healing, but then they just keep playing Moria every turn, and I just couldn't really handle their board going wide so fast like every turn.
Yep. Have you tried? I've seen like a couple Uta lists online as well as some pudding. I'm not entirely sure if they reach the tier of B tier.
Mm-hmm.
I think they have a couple glaring holes,
Right. We can add
mostly
another tier
involving
below if we
Kofi.
want.
What's up?
You can add another tier below where it's like C tier, where it's kind
Okay.
of like rogue decks.
Okay. Yeah. We can just do that and just have those two. I think they're really interesting lists. I think they have some like kind of natural problems. Um, Pudding can be very good against relatively slow decks, like Lucci and BY.
Mm-hmm.
Just like going super duper fast and putting 10 costs in play until they run out of ice ages, basically. Um, which can be really, really gross when you're just trying to stabilize relatively quickly. But the problem is, like, I think being a 4 life leader is just going to be too bad against Dofi in particular.
Right.
Um,
There
and
is
then
one deck
additionally,
that I wanted to shout
okay.
out. I played against Eggman or Hayden, and he played Garp, and I was on Dofi, and that matchup felt miserable. So I'm not sure if there's anything there. Like it probably still loses to like Lucci or Bonnie, but if you expect 10 Dofis, then Garp might be the answer, just because you don't need to spend your Dawn or cards on cost reduction because most of the cards are in range, and you can just attach Dawn to your leader and then just Rebecca Brook everything.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I do think 3 cost Brook is a very obnoxious card against
Yeah.
Dofi in general, and any deck that's good at facilitating that's just going to be very dumb into it.
Yeah.
I really want to try. Was he playing like the no red card version?
Yeah, because
Okay.
there's not a lot of synergy between red and black cards anyway. Like maybe you can play Nami and find your black straw hat cards or something, so you can find your Brook. But you're just basically a black deck with a really good like leader effect because the cost reduction. You don't need to play like Ice Ages or anything. You save on card advantage that way, and just Rebecca Brook every turn, and you're safe from the 7k swings.
Yep. That's Power of Rebecca. It's like very obnoxious card against Dofi as well. Um, Never cut them, please. Cut them, please don't. Uta's also been super popular, at least just in terms of just like testing online. I think the deck is quite powerful, and like relying on 8 cost Kid to kind of like stop a lot of early aggression can be super good when this deck is really good at just drawing like 3 cards a turn between like their 3 cost Utas, their leader ability, stuff like that. The main problem this deck has is just like either early KOs with Lucci, since the deck's really good at KOing early bodies now, or just pudding. Like this deck is really good at amassing too big of a hand, and that's just like a little too hard to come back from.
Yeah,
If your opponent gets rid of your entire board.
yeah, it's not
Um,
makes sense.
yeah. What about the other decks that were popular in 8? Like, do you think Zuro is going to be popular? Do you think Kaldara is going to be popular? Or do you think they like the new aggro decks of Dofi and Floofy have kind of pushed them to the wayside?
I think it's exactly that, where the old aggro decks, they don't out aggro Dofi anymore. Dofi is like an aggro deck, but also a control deck, but also gains resources. So you're not going to be faster than Dofi because they play out like more menacing bodies than you. Like for one example is Zuro. You're going to play a bunch of like 4K bodies, maybe 1K bodies. I'm going to play a bunch of 5K bodies as Dofi. That draw me cards as well. So you're going to be slower than me and I draw more cards than you. So that's why I think the aggro decks are definitely going to get out aggroed in a Dofi meta. We can put them in C tier as well, just because they're still good decks. If you avoid all the Dolphin matchups or win your couple Dolphin matchups, you can still do well. Same thing with Reiju, and same thing with Calgara as well.
That makes sense. Shout out to Long for his win, but a little over a week ago. Do you think Yamato is also going to be in the same boat, where it's just not really a great aggro deck right now?
So that's something I haven't tested. In my mind, Dofi plays for the Boa blockers, and I think that's probably the only blocker that it plays. So you may get there, but it probably falls into the same category more often than not, where you're just gonna get out aggroed by Dofi. So I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't want to speak too much because I don't know. So we gotta ask Long about that.
Yeah, we also need to ask Long. My main worry is the quantity of 2Ks in Dofi. Like let's play minimum 12 at high as 15 I've seen online, and that might be a little bit too much of a hassle. Just like trying to overpower like Dofi just having that many cards. Um, but maybe it's just good enough if they just don't draw a Boa at all. So that's just a kind of food for thought.
Right.
Okay.
And then there's a couple of decks that I have in my mind where if you expect a lot of Dopis, you can just win. Like one of them was Garp. The other was Carrot, actually. I had the idea where Carrot, you could just play 4 carrots like you normally do. You can have like a typical green game plan of playing ACOS Kate as well. But you have a lot of cards that's like stun cards or prevent them from attacking, like I believe, Inuarushi, the 5 cost 6K that keeps two of your opponent's cards rested. And then if you establish a board like that and just keep playing carrots, then your opponents can't really answer them all, especially if they're cutting out on cards like Gravity Blade.
Have you played the BY versus Carrot matchup? Because that matchup's very, very difficult from the BY side as well.
Oh yeah, I played it back in like I think the beginning of OP7 or 8, and that matchup was pretty terrible just because all the 5 cost bodies I'm playing out get rested and I don't want to protect them. And then later on, like when they go for game, like they have an easy, free like straw sword because they can just rest all my blockers.
Yeah, they're resting blockers. They also have a restand card too, which is also really fun. So a lot of tools to kind of mess around with you.
So
yeah,
decent matchup in the top 2 decks, and even the Lucci matchup. When I was kind of building Carrot, you have some cards that can get around the Lucci matchup, like the 4 cost Peckhams. That it's like the 5 cost Luffy that protects your board for getting KO'd, and you also have an event that prevents your entire board from getting KO'd for like an entire turn. So there might be some options there. I do think consistency is gonna be the biggest thing, where you gotta have to build to beat everything, and that means you're very mediocre at drawing what you need exactly in that matchup. But I mean, there might be something there.
I gotta test some Carrot myself at this point. All right, I got some green to build. I swore I would never play a green in a tournament ever again, but I need to change that.
Yeah, I think one of my goals is like the top of every color. I think I'm missing a purple deck right now, so if you have a top of green, then maybe you need to do that.
Oh, all right. I guess I got work to do.
And then there's other decks that like pop up top of my head is like Dofi, same thing. Birdcage just ruins Dofi's or Blue Dofi's day. If you want a hard counter for the Dofi meta, but I don't think you do that well into BY. Don't do that well into Lucci. So it might just be a pipe dream.
I also don't think Birdcage is actually that effective. If Dofi kind of does some kind of funny stuff. The deck has a bunch of weird lines that involve just like bouncing your board back to your hand with like Law Effect and then replaying it. It comes up a lot against NL, where your turn can just be like Jinbei Law, bounce your 2 rested characters, play Jinbei Weevil, and now all of a sudden your board's all active again. And that probably comes up a ton against Birdcage as well. And that's probably just like a little too obnoxious, to be honest.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then the other deck that I kind of went under the radar is Red Black Sabo, and that was mainly a black deck counter, if I remember correctly, like against Lucci, just because your board is really hard to KO. So you're really good in like any kind of black mirror.
Yep.
But you probably struggle into Dofi.
Yeah, I do think Dofi might be a problem just because like most of the deck just relies on either Shiraya or Borsalino as like their early blockers, and those are really easy to just bounce with Law, or just like bouncing with like their early like Red Rocks or Gravity Blades. 5 cost Hina is probably like the blocker that you'll probably have to rely on the most from the Dofi matchup, just because it's a 5K or a 5 cost that also like effectively stuns 2 attackers, which is really nice. Um, I have to like, I probably need to test that out a little bit more. My problem with that deck was kind of its closing speed. The deck's really good at just like stabilizing the board, but after a while, it doesn't really. It can't. It's hard for the deck to actually close the game out, aside from just like drawing Morias or dragons. So I have to mess around with that and see what kind of works best for it.
Right, makes sense. And yeah, now I think we just listing decks that we think might have potential, but probably not there yet. And just putting them F tier. Our red green law. Is there anything we need to say about that? It was the original blue Dofi counter.
It was the original blue Dofi counter. I'm not entirely sure if that's the case anymore.
Right.
Um, we played OP1, OP02 plenty, and just like the fact that Dofi has to put in characters rested every turn, and Otama just like reducing them and kind of making them free pickings for the turn can be really, really absurd. But I'm not entirely sure if that deck can stabilize to the point where it's fine. And I do think pudding is still like a relatively annoying card for Law.
Right.
I think it always wants to go to 2, and like when you get pudding in those kind of spots, it's probably not a great idea.
Yeah. So we're thinking C tier or F tier for this?
I'll put it in C. I know a lot of people are probably going to try to play it. Shout out to Nicky Goldman. He's probably going to play it at least once, right?
Yeah. And then the other 3 decks that I thought were Perona, Cross is probably coping it as we speak. But I think same thing. You can't really answer 7K swings. Like you're a black deck that doesn't play Rebecca, and Rebecca is like the best card against aggro decks. But there might be something there. Like traditionally, it's good. Like it's decent into BY, decent into basically any other deck here besides Dofi. So there could be something there. So that's why I
never a great matchup. But,
right.
It could be fine, but yeah. I think there's like Dofi and like Lucio, like the main issues I have with Perona. But if you can figure those out, it'd probably be super powerful.
It does get 9-cost Shanks now, which is my biggest problem is that it couldn't answer Jack really efficiently, but now you have 9-cost Shanks, which might be okay.
That's true. It doesn't answer it on 7 though. Or
yeah.
It's on 8 on turn, which is like a really big misstep. That just happens a lot in Black Mirrors where Jack on specifically 7s is like so much harder to deal with than Jack on 8. So
right. Yeah.
I gotta try that. Right.
And the other 2 decks I thought of were Rebecca. Like it recently got top 64 or 32 online regional, and as a BY player, I'm terrified of this matchup. I learned like really early on that Rebecca is a really bad matchup for BY. They can swing into your guys. They can rest all you guys, and then they also play cards like 7-cost Luffy, and then just double swing at you for bigger numbers, forcing you to be at 1 life. And they also play blue cards that bot deck your cards like Gravity Blade. So I learned that was a really bad matchup for BY. I'm not sure how it does now into like an aggressive leader like Dofi.
I can't imagine it being good. Like, back then a lot, or even still now, a lot of Rebecca's engine to deal with a lot of mid-sized bodies just involved Orlumbus. Like Orlumbus plus Kiro, stuff like that. And that's like way more disruptible now from the Dofi side just because of 4-cost law. So it's gonna be way harder to set up an actual good way to clear things early. And since the fact the leader can't attack, it's gonna be really hard to even like try to contest a lot of the Dofi's board. And kind of like starting them resources is only gonna work for so long.
Right.
I'm probably not particularly high on Rebecca in that matchup, but I do think it can work in specifically BY. But I've also noticed that like Rebecca and Taluchi can be really big of a problem.
Right.
It's like similar with like the NL philosophy, where like if you try to starve your opponent for too long, or try to slow the game down for too long, they sloop their Morias bottom with like Lucci's putting them on the bottom, and you can't keep up with that every turn.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and then like you still struggle to NL because they play too many high costs. Bonnie, I'm actually not sure, and I'm not sure about Purple Luffy either. But Purple Luffy is pretty aggressive on its own right.
I am not entirely sure. I have to test those out, but
yeah. So I mean, we can put an F tier for now. But I mean, you can look back on this, and then if Rebecca wins the tournament, like we're giving it credit now, it could do well. We're just not sure.
Yeah.
And then the last deck that I wanted to talk about was Katakuri. So this is probably yellow is probably the least impressive starter deck that came out. I'm not even sure if you're playing any new cards. Like maybe you're playing the 6-house Lunan, but do you think that pushes the envelope any of the yellow decks?
I don't think so. The problem is like I think the Anel is just the control counterpart of Katakuri, and Katakuri is like the much more aggressive version. I just don't think that the aggressive slant can ever keep up with Dofi. And the 6-cost Lumin's like fine, but I think it's like so much worse than the 7 costs, and not playing many bricks or like trying to add a more non-counter to your deck is just not going to be that profitable for you.
Right.
I honestly think the best card from the deck for Katakuri is actually the Brule 2K. It's like it's a small improvement, but it is kind of good for the deck. but you're gonna have to work with the tools you already have in terms of like triggering Charlotte Parasparrow, triggering like Nekomamushi or crackers, and just trying to get your aggression that way. It can work, but I think it's not going to be good enough against specifically Dofi.
Mm,
And I think that the BY matchup's still going to be quite rough.
right.
You just don't really have any answers to 5-cost Sabo. That card just like, kind of neuters a lot of your early aggression and your late game potential. So
Right, yeah, and then you're probably still gonna struggle with Purple Luffy. Bonnie and Nell, I'm not sure. They seem like kind of close matchups. Lucci is probably unfavored still.
yeah, probably.
Yeah, those are all the decks that I thought. Maybe you want to talk about Moria. Moria is just a deck that runs that can see the best card the most often because you can just loop Moria, but that's probably all it has going for it. It's kind of like a black version of Blue Dofi where you just go wide really quickly, but you're just probably a little bit too slow.
Yeah, I also think it's probably a little too slow. I think it's like the fact that Great Eruption got banned a while ago just made this deck a little too anemic on the early turns, and it just hasn't really picked up since then. I kind of miss this leader, to be honest, but yeah, I just don't think it's like particularly great in this current format.
Yeah. So other than that, I'm just gonna start adding decks, the rest of the decks in F tier. If there's
Yeah,
anything you see that you think can go higher, you can add it there. But out of these, I think you're just kind of grasping for straws.
yeah, I think you're just gonna like, but there's like some sliver of potential that might be worth looking into, but honestly, without like seeing enough gameplay, I'd probably just put the rest of them in F tier. I think.
Right. Right. I mean, one deck we didn't talk about was Smoker. That's just another.
Ooh, okay. I do love this deck. I do think it has like a main problem that I just don't think it can fix is that it kind of has similar issues as Black Luffy,
Mhm.
where it's only really good at KOing one body a turn.
Right.
5-cost Tashigi makes it really good in the mid game, which like Black Luffy did struggle with. Like it relied on like 5-cost Luffy, and that's about it. Or 5-cost Sanji, but now we have like Tashigi, which is a super powerful card. But the problem is it's like late game is just like a much more lackluster compared to Black Luffy's.
Right.
And sure, you still have Jack, you still have Moria, and the new Sengoku from the set, making you discard 2 Black Navy cards and drawing 3, because you see enough cards that maybe you find your Morias more often than the other Black decks. But even still, I think it's just like a little too anemic compared to everything else that I really wouldn't consider it.
Gotcha. Will we consider that C tier or F tier? If we add in C tier, we're just basically saying Moria is carrying the deck. But why would you rather play Smoker?
If you want to put every black deck in C tier,
yeah,
that's also fine.
That's true.
But yeah, you can put it in C tier for now. I think it has playability. My main issue is I would probably never consider it over any of the other black decks, which is my main issue.
Right. Okay. I don't see anything else that I want to add, so I think this is probably what we have, and we have our 2 banned decks, Sakazuki and RP Law. But yeah, this is looking like what I planned as well. Like I'm glad we didn't have a lot of disagreements there. And this is also like the early beginning of the format. The format could develop where some new deck gets some crazy tech, or you might read the format and see that you're gonna play like 8 Dofis and then build around that, and then another deck might be really good then. But this is probably what going in blind for 8.5 that we expect to be topping.
Yep, and a lot of these decks that are in A and B tier just definitely have very good matchups, even in the S tier bracket, but they also have relatively bad matchups. So like as we see the first couple weeks of tournaments, if you just see seeds of Dofi, you can kind of reevaluate and play something like a Nell. If you just see only Lucci's, probably should go back to BY. But it should be a fun couple weeks trying to see what things will happen. And this is like a 3-tournament weekend coming up, right? Between Madison, San Diego, and an online Treasure Cup. So it's going to be a lot of data for us to work with.
Yeah, I think also North America and Latin America and Oceania have tournaments, but I think Europe is still in 8 because they have some product problems. So it'll be interesting because we'll have a lot of data from a lot of tournaments this weekend, and we'll see how people react and how the meta ships then. But yeah, thank you guys for joining us here. We're gonna keep trying to give you guys some great content here. We have a lot planned out. But yeah.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you guys soon.